By the time the fifth video game console generation rolled around, which began in the early to mid-90s and lasted until around 2001, technology had advanced to the point that truly polygonal 3D graphics were not only possible on relatively affordable home console hardware, but had become something of a standard. The Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Nintendo 64, which were the biggest and most competitive consoles of the generation, allowed developers to create 3D environments for their games, something that was technically possible, but comparatively limited and rudimentary on the 16-bit hardware of the previous console generation. One development team, Exact, which is now part of Japan Studio, a first-party developer for Sony Interactive Entertainment, had created a 3D game previously, March 1994's Geograph Seal. Geograph Seal was developed for the Sharp X68000, a 16-bit home computer. The game puts the player in the shoes of a bipedal robot who is tasked with destroying hostile robots by either shooting them or jumping on them, all from a first-person perspective. The player can double or triple jump, allowing them to soar to extreme heights and plan their landing by watching the shadow from above. The game was a big success for the aging X68000, pushing the capabilities of the hardware to its near limits. Roughly 9 months after Geograph Seal's release, Sony's PlayStation was released in Japan. Exact had already begun work on a tech demo earlier that year with the new console, with the working title of Springman. This demo made use of the same game engine and overall gameplay elements as Geograph Seal. Springman would lead to the development of a proper game based on it, with Sony pairing up the existing Exact team with another development team, Ultra, to create the game. This project was Jumping Flash, which was released to the public in 1995. The final game was very similar to Geograph Seal in terms of gameplay, but with a notably different presentation and story. While Geograph Seal fits snugly into a rather traditional sci-fi mold, Jumping Flash was cute, vibrant, and a little silly. The game's story is that of a robotic rabbit named Robert, who is tasked with stopping the evil plot of an astrophysicist named Baron Aloha. Baron Aloha has removed large, circular chunks of an Earth-like planet and turned them into resorts he can capitalize on. Robert is sent by Universal City Hall to take the carrot-like jet pods, which propel Baron Aloha's stolen islands, and eventually reach and stop Baron Aloha himself. As previously mentioned, Jumping Flash does share plenty of similarities with Geograph Seal, which become immediately obvious just by seeing gameplay of the two next to each other. The first-person perspective, jumping with the perspective automatically shifting downwards upon double or triple jumping, and destroying enemies by jumping on them or shooting them with a variety of laser and explosive weapons, are the major gameplay elements that are shared between them. Jumping Flash does change and add a few things in terms of gameplay when compared to its spiritual predecessor. The game is split up into 6 worlds with unique themes, each consisting of 3 islands. On the first 2 islands, the player's primary objective consists of collecting the 4 jet pods, then landing on the exit pad to finish the level. Each level does have a time limit, but the amount of time given is generous considering that the jet pods are never terribly difficult to find. And should the player ever have trouble finding them, the jet pod locations will appear on the radar for them once the timer rolls around to 3 minutes. Fireworks that can be used as weapons can be found in the overworld or through enemy drops, each with their own function and a higher damage output than jumping or the default laser weapon. Up to 3 of these fireworks can be carried at a time. Unlike the basic laser weapon, the ammunition for the fireworks is limited, so the player will need to keep an eye out for additional pickups. Other power-ups include health refills, timer refills, power-ups that freeze time temporarily, and a temporary invincibility power-up called a power pill, which also allows the player to destroy enemies simply by touching them. All these are collected in the same manner as fireworks. The player can also destroy enemies to pick up the coins they drop, which add to the total score, or hunt down optional bonus levels in which the player attempts to pop all of the balloons present before the timer hits 0. The third island of each world is dedicated to a boss fight, with the simple goal of destroying each unique boss and avoiding death yourself. The game's visuals are lighthearted and colorful, full of cute enemies like frogs and top hats, penguins with bow ties, TVs that fly using bat-like wings, kiwis, like the birds, and that's naming just a few. The floating islands that the game takes place on are varied and unique from each other, ranging from a grassy town with houses, blimps, and windmills, amusement parks, a city filled with giant advertisements and glowing neon lights, and more. Being an early PlayStation title, the game's visuals are understandably simplistic compared to many later games on the system. This isn't a detriment for this particular game, however. The simple models, with many enemies notably using vertex colors rather than textures, and the minimalistic textures that are used, mesh well with the overall aesthetic. The character and environment models are simple enough to fit the game's art style, but not so simple that it's ever difficult to discern what a model is intended to represent. The game's music was composed by the late Takeo Maratsu, who also composed music for a number of games and anime. The music is very upbeat and does a great job of matching the game's environments and tone. When it comes to my personal experience with Jumping Flash, I had a great time with it. Something I've brought up many times on my Famicom Weekend series is how much I enjoy the basic and easy to grasp, but simultaneously addictive gameplay of early arcade games. And Jumping Flash carries over those gameplay principles almost effortlessly into an early 3D console game. 3D games were, quite literally, an entirely new dimension for most game developers to adjust to. While the prospect was unquestionably exciting, it must have been at least a little intimidating. How would the gameplay concepts that worked so well for 2D games in previous years, such as platforming, be able to make a smooth transition into 3D? Jumping Flash did remarkably well at this, especially as one of the earliest games for one of the first 3D home consoles. Its movement controls don't feel as immediately natural as the following year's Super Mario 64, but the fact that a game with 3D platforming has controls that feel this good before Super Mario 64 came along and set the gold standard for 3D platforming controls is a testament to Jumping Flash's quality. I thought the inclusion of the camera tilting downwards automatically upon a double or triple jump, along with Rabbit's shadow always being positioned directly below them, were very smart ways of making positional awareness a non-issue for players. More complex aiming does require the player to hold R1, which switches the D-pad and left stick from movement to camera control. Given that this game was released before the DualShock controller, which added 2 analog sticks to the standard controller with no joysticks, this makes a lot of sense. This was also before twin-stick movement and camera controls were common, even in FPSs. Having been spoiled by twin-stick control schemes in more modern games, I did wonder how this game would feel with that movement system, such as in a hypothetical modern remaster or remake. Jumping Flash also takes advantage of the PS1's full motion video capabilities, as many games on the console did. There are quite a few of these cute little pre-rendered cutscenes throughout the game, depicting various scenes such as Baron Aloha plotting his scheme, or Rabbit launching himself towards each individual world. They add even more charm to a game that's already overflowing with it. One small thing that may or may not be an issue, depending on your personal preferences, is the game's difficulty, or lack thereof. Jumping Flash is by all means a laid-back experience. Personally, I never felt like I was in danger of a game over, or in many cases losing a life at all. The jet pods aren't difficult to track down, even in later worlds, especially with indicators on screen and on the minimap if you're in a level long enough. Bosses aren't much of a threat either. You can essentially brute force your way through all of them without much of a need for strategy. If you're primarily looking for something challenging, Jumping Flash may not be for you. However, if you're looking for a fun, breezy, aesthetically pleasing, arcade-like retro experience, Jumping Flash is definitely worth giving a try, especially if you're interested in playing a game that has an important place in the history of both 3D games and the first PlayStation console. At the time of this recording, it's also available on the PlayStation Store on modern systems like the PS4 and PS5, so it's still quite accessible if you'd like to give it a spin. But that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.